Welcome into the Trevor Staub Show, episode number 50. We've made it all the way to 50, and today we have a really special guest. We've got Chris Clark, attorney at law. You may know him from discgolf.law, but he's a legal expert, and we've got him to talk about this Gannon versus Prodigy lawsuit. I think it's going to be a really productive conversation. We're going to get a lot of really cool insight from somebody who has experience in this area. I also reached out to Twitter before this interview, getting all of the people's questions that you're dying to know some answers to, so I was able to ask him those as well. So it's a really cool interview. You're going to love it. Let's hop into it. All right, we welcome in our guest for today's show. Today we have Chris Clark. Chris is the founder of discgolf.law. He is our legal expert today that we needed to bring in. We've certainly had quite a bit of interesting things happening in the disc golf world. Obviously, everybody knows now about the Gannon Buhr and Prodigy lawsuit. So we figured, we kind of done our own analysis on Grip Locked and some other shows. We needed to bring somebody who is very experienced in this realm to kind of talk us through it. So thanks for joining the show, Chris.
Yeah, Trevor, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to be on. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, definitely. So before we kind of get into things, Chris, I just want you to kind of talk a little bit about your legal background and what you've been doing in the disc golf industry through discgolf.law.
Sure, thanks. So I'm a disc golfer. Started playing a very long time ago, probably about 30 years ago or so. I joined the PDGA in 2000. And I've been in law practice now for about 21 and a half years. And my background, I got my law degree at UNC in Chapel Hill. And for most of my career have been working with entrepreneurs and businesses, helping companies get set up and started, done a lot of mergers and acquisitions, that kind of thing. Done a lot of work in the technology space and the healthcare space, but just always have had a passion for our sport. And it was my son and I, my son Matt and I, about 2 years ago, as not only disc golfers but of fans of the sport, we started noticing, hey, there's some big dollar contracts coming along and some big dollar sponsorship deals, and viewership is growing. And then, of course, we all know what happened during COVID, and we got a lot of new players and a lot of new fans of the game. And so we said, understanding the culture of our sport, which has been very sort of community based, I think it's been very trusting. And, I think the business side, at least what we've learned over the years has been no different. It's been very much sort of like a handshake deal based type industry. And we just saw it coming down the pike that, look, there's going to be a need for professionals in this area to, serve companies and serve individuals in a way that maybe hasn't been as needed in the past. And that's a good thing. That's a great thing. We love growth of the sport, right? So, to answer what you asked, what we've been doing, we've been working with some players, handful of professional players. We've been working with companies. We've been working with a lot of startups and entrepreneurs. It's interesting. We weren't really expecting this, but we've also been approached by, for example, a lot of parents of young disc golfers who are saying, hey, we think our kid might have a future in this. What do we need to do to be protected? Things like that. One of my favorite things that we do is we help companies and players protect their trademarks, so their logos or their brands and things like that. But, bringing it around to the topic of the day, a lot of what we do has to do with drafting contracts, reviewing, revising, negotiating them. And so, that's really what we love, and that's what we're passionate about. We're really thankful and grateful that we get to do it relative to this sport that we love so much.
Yeah, certainly. I think that it's awesome that the sport has gotten to that point, like you mentioned, where we're seeing outside experts and professionals from various different industries coming in to reinforce what we have already. And I think that the legal infrastructure was one of the areas that disc golf was going to see the biggest need, especially with all that money pumped into the sport so quickly. You got to protect your assets at the end of the day, and that eventually means that some real professional lawyers have to get into the sport. So just to kind of help everybody out, I'll kind of present the timeline. If you haven't been following what's been going on in disc golf, it'd be hard not to at this point. But basically, we have Gannon Buhr a little while ago before the All-Star weekend, suddenly announces that he's leaving Prodigy Disc. It comes out a bit later that Prodigy is suing Gannon Buhr for breach of contract. So there's now a legal dispute happening. This is certainly unprecedented in the sport, seeing something this public and this big between two just huge figures in the sport, one being a very large company and one being a rising star, very popular player. So this thing first hits the news. I mean, I was just sitting there. I saw it on my phone. I couldn't believe it. As somebody who, this is what you do. You brought yourself into the sport for this, or brought law into the sport for this reason. When you first see the news break, I realize it's kind of grim to be excited over a lawsuit. Obviously, there's a lot of bad things involved. But was there any kind of excitement that, oh, this is finally what I've been preparing for? This is going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, so I think you really said it perfectly. It was a little bit exciting to see this news break. It was surprising. It's funny because I was out in Tucson for the Disc Golf Pro Tour Industry Conference and for the All-Star Weekend. And on Thursday, I played in the Pro-Am there. And the pro on our card was Isaac Robinson, but Gannon was on the card right behind us. And so A few holes we had a backup, and I got to chat with Gannon a little bit, not about anything legal at all, just kind of small talk. And I left Tucson Sunday morning, flew back here to Charlotte where I am now, and got off the plane, drove home, and literally right about the time I got home, my phone started blowing up with this news. Yeah. So I kind of wish, this is like what you were saying, I don't wish anybody ever gets sued, but right. I wish it had happened maybe a day earlier while I'd still been in Tucson, and maybe I could have had some more conversations about it with Gannon, or maybe not even necessarily with him, but with others that were there. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly big news in our sport, and I think we're going to learn a lot from it.
Yeah, I would say so. There's definitely going to be a lot of precedent, and it's going to be very interesting how it plays out. So one thing that I noticed is this thing breaks initially, and you have this idea of a very large company suing a young individual. And before the case filings even got out, the public is pretty much initially just all jumping on Gannon's side. That's where everybody's going to go for starters. Very likable player. And that's just kind of typical when you have the big company suing the young individual, I would imagine, in the law world. Was that something you expected to see, and is that something you expect to continue to see throughout this case, kind of regardless of what happens, just because of the social element of it?
I think so. I think so. Let me maybe stand up for Prodigy a little bit first. I think that the timing of this was what drove them to go ahead and file the lawsuit when they did, because I think what they saw happening was one of their most valuable sponsored players potentially walking away from the contract, not getting bought out of the contract, which I think they far would have preferred, but just literally terminating and walking away. And they don't want that. They don't believe he's entitled to do that. And so they said, look, All-Star Weekend starts, this would have been, last week, but starts tomorrow. And then the season itself starts the following weekend. If we don't do something now, we may lose this guy and it may be too late. So, I think it is always, in my experience, preferable to try to resolve these kind of disputes in some way other than through litigation. But I think Prodigy probably felt like their hand was forced in that way. However, I certainly have seen everybody that I've talked to. It seems like the overwhelming support is on Gannon's side. I was just talking earlier to somebody today who said they saw a disc golf retailer that had marked down all the Prodigy discs in their store for free. They said anybody who wants these discs, come get them. So yeah, there's all kinds of backlash going on against Prodigy. I think some of it's probably valid, and some of it I think maybe isn't. But as a person who writes contracts for a living, I believe contracts should be respected, and Prodigy believes that Gannon is breaching their contract, so they took what they feel was appropriate legal action.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that was kind of my thoughts too. Is like the timing it was unfortunate for Prodigy and what they had to do, but it seems like potentially the situation could be that they just kind of had their hand forced, basically. Like, I think a lot of people really jumped, and then because then the case filings obviously became public, and then that kind of changed things up. People are now, I've seen a little bit of a shift now that that's out. Obviously, Prodigy is filing. This is what they're alleging. Now, as everybody has been looking at these, and there's been a lot of commentary about them, do you think there's any like key elements that people might be missing as they are kind of going over the case, drawing their conclusions? Because right now you have a few sides to it. You have people that are saying, well, we see everything here that's filed. It seems like Prodigy's case is legit. And then you have other people that are claiming things more on Gannon's side. Is there things that you think that people are maybe overlooking in everything?
Yeah, I think there's maybe a few things, Trevor. So one thing is, many of the complaints that Gannon has about Prodigy have to do with promises that were made to him that were not fulfilled. And he has evidence of those promises. He has text messages and email messages, I believe. The unfortunate thing is that in the state of Georgia, like in most states, it's going to be difficult to get those outside communications admitted into evidence because most states will only look to inside the four corners of that written contract. And so when Gannon raised these issues, and then later Gannon's counsel, Gannon's lawyer, raised these issues with Prodigy, Prodigy said, look, we don't consider these to be a material breach. And so that brings me to the second thing. What's a material breach of this contract? One is that non-payment is a breach. But if Prodigy fails to make a payment, Gannon can notify them of that, and they've got a 30-day period to correct their mistake. And that is something that happened here. So Prodigy has said, hey, our bad, we didn't pay you this bonus we were supposed to, but now we have. You notified us, and now we have. And all these other things all these other issues you've raised, like your signature series disc and product quality and things like that, those aren't material breaches of this contract. And here's what I think maybe some people don't realize, or some people might be missing about this. There's a lot of, even though, as you correctly stated, the court documents, including Gannon's contract, those are now public. However, there are portions of the contract that are redacted. And that mainly has to do with financial information, including things like, what are the financial metrics for Gannon's bonuses or commissions for disc sales and things like that. So to answer what you asked, I don't think we know all there is to know about what Gannon was promised or entitled to in the contract relative to those redacted sections.
Right. I think that was a key thing. And as soon as I saw that the contract was in the filings, I immediately started scrolling, because I was like, surely if I had one undergrad law class, but I was like, I know they can't be including the financial details in this and just launching it out there. And so when I saw all of that black space essentially redacted, I was like, there's going to be more to this. Like, we haven't seen the last of the contract. It's not quite as black and white as people might think. But yeah, I think that'll be a big thing. So one of the kind of broad questions, and this may be just impossible to answer at this point, but as things stand right now, so where we are as things have gone out, and based on kind of your just experience and the precedent that you've seen maybe in similar situations in other areas, what do you think the most likely outcome of this lawsuit is? Maybe not even saying a victory for either side, but a settlement, this actually goes to trial. Like, how do you think this actually ends?
Yeah, I think there's very little chance that it ever goes to trial, and I expect it will probably be resolved fairly quickly. And how does it get resolved? I think, again, just my opinion, just guessing, trying to predict the future, but my guess would be that Gannon and Prodigy agree on some type of financial settlement, and then Gannon goes and joins a new sponsor. And my hunch is probably part of that new sponsorship deal will be the sponsor paying part or all of what Gannon owes to Prodigy. That would be my guess. If it works out some other way, I would be surprised.
Before we get into the rest of the interview, we just have a quick word from a sponsor of today's show, Aura. Anyone can find anything on the internet that includes your full legal name, your personal email, your home address, your phone number, or even your relatives. This information is possible because of data brokers who profit by selling your information to robocallers, telemarketers, spammers, and anyone else that wants to learn more about you. That's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor of the show, Aura. Aura will identify data brokers that are exposing your information and automatically submit opt-out requests on your behalf. They'll even opt you out of junk mail and telemarketing lists. You can use my link, aura.com/foundation-disc-golf, to try 2 weeks for free and see how many data brokers are sharing your information. Also linked in the description, or you can scan the QR code here on the screen. Aura also monitors your emails and passwords to see if they were involved in a data breach and exposed on the dark web, and gives you recommendations on what to do if that happens. Aura's app also features a VPN, password manager, real-time credited identity theft monitoring, internet parental controls, and protects your devices from malware. Aura has almost every internet safety tool you'll ever need, all inside of one app. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. If you sign up right now, Aura will give you a free 2-week trial with my link. You'll be shocked about how much of your private information Aura will find over those 2 weeks. So go to aura.com/foundation-disc-golf, or you can go ahead and scan the QR code on the screen to start your free trial. It's also linked in the description. Let's get back into the interview. Yeah, that's what I keep hearing and what people are speculating, because it's hard to imagine a scenario where Gannon stays with Prodigy, just because who does that really benefit at this point now that this is all out in public? That definitely seemed unlikely. So that's what I would think. But yeah, there are plenty of people who see it other ways, for sure. But we'll just have to see. I asked yesterday on Twitter. I went on there and I was like, hey, I'm going to have a legal expert on my show this week. Go ahead and just send in all your questions, because there's so many unanswered questions for people. And I got a lot of really common, really good questions that also I was wondering about too. So we're kind of going to go through them. The first one, and I think this is one that's very popular, is could and should Gannon sign with another manufacturer if the case does continue to drag on and maybe it does kind of end up on a wait list for trial? Is that something he should even think about doing, and could he even do?
That's a great question, because one thing that Prodigy did when they filed this lawsuit is they also filed for a temporary restraining order, and a preliminary injunction. And essentially what they were asking for is they were asking the court to require Gannon to continue to fulfill his obligations under the contract, which include not signing with any other sponsor. Mm-hmm. The court declined to do that for now. I believe they said, we'll take it under advisement, but they did not issue that temporary restraining order right now. If Gannon were to do what this question was asked, if this does continue to drag on and Gannon was just like, screw it, I'm going to go sign with somebody else, the court might not look favorably on that, and they may go ahead and then issue that restraining order telling him, no, you're not allowed to do that. So, unfortunately, I think Gannon probably begrudgingly is going to continue throwing Prodigy discs and maybe even wearing Prodigy apparel in the short term, which is another reason that I think this likely will proceed towards settlement quickly, because, nobody, and especially including Gannon, wants to just see him out there not very excited about the plastic that he's throwing.
Right. Yeah. Certainly seems like a lose-lose situation there. Another popular question I was getting a lot. So in the court filings, you see, I believe it was the CEO that basically claims he throws out the number $1.5 million in potential lost revenue. Obviously, just kind of a number that's thrown out there. It's a statement. Impossible to really calculate that. But a lot of people are wondering, what damages could Prodigy realistically claim if they were to prevail in this case?
Another fantastic question, because as you correctly stated, it's entirely speculative.
Yeah.
Is Gannon going to rise through the ranks and be, the number one player by the end of the season? That's a possible scenario. Is he going to get injured in Las Vegas and sit out the season? That's a possible scenario. We hope that doesn't happen, obviously, but it is entirely speculative. I guess all I would say relative to Prodigy's estimate of what their damages might be, I would point everyone also to the number that Prodigy included in their court filing, where they said that they expected 1 million people to stream the All-Star event, which I think I laughed out loud when I read that. Look, part of what we do as lawyers is we advocate for our clients, right? But you still have to stay within the bounds of reality. So
right.
I suspect that 1.5 million in damages was a pretty generous, inflated number. The same way that hey, 1 million people are going to watch Gannon on the All-Star stream.
Right. Yeah, I think there were a few lines in the filings that I read, and I was like, interesting. Like I felt the advocation. We'll say that. that's kind of how
me too.
How I felt as I read a few of those lines. But we'll see if the judge knows too much about the All-Star stream and things of that nature. But okay, so next question, and this one you actually already answered, which was, are verbal non-contractual agreements enforceable in this case? And you kind of mentioned that. You were mentioning more the text messages. Is anything verbal enforceable?
So my position, I did a little bit of research on this because, I'm based in North Carolina and I'm most familiar with North Carolina law. So I did look at Georgia law, which is what applies to this case. And the general rule is no, nothing outside what's in that written contract is likely to be able to be introduced as evidence. There are certain cases where it can, if the contract is vague or ambiguous. There's some other ways that these outside things can come in, but it's pretty rare. So if you had asked me this question a few days ago, I would have said no, absolutely not. It's highly unlikely these come in. I have read a lot about this in the last few days, and one thing I did read, it was actually a post I think a lawyer made maybe on Reddit. He was suggesting that there might be some type of creative theory that Gannon's counsel could use that might actually get these things in. I don't know enough about that specific thing that he was talking about to say how likely it is it would succeed, but I'm going to stick by my original answer, which is it's very likely that those verbal conversations, text messages, all that stuff will not come into evidence.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's what I've been hearing for the most. So the next thing you mentioned, the most likely outcome here is a settlement. That's what most people, I think, would imagine in a case like this. I mean, I know that there's usually, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a staggering percentage of cases that are settled versus going to trial. Like, it's very high. Yeah, so
it's 97% according to the American Judges Association or something. It's
right.
97%.
Yes, because you see lawsuit and your mind goes to like the court drawings of like Gannon Buhr on the stand, Prodigy there, and like realistically, that's probably not going to happen. But if a settlement does happen, besides the monetary, just exchange, what would you expect to be in this deal? Are there other things that they're able to include? Like something like, could Prodigy say, hey, we need a public apology? Are there things like that they could demand?
Yeah, absolutely. They could ask for that. I doubt they would get that. What they might be able to get, though, which is common in settlement agreements, is a non-disparagement clause in there that just says, hey, Gannon, we're not going to say anything bad about you. You don't say anything bad about us. And a lot of times that's in there just so that, we can really get this behind us. We don't need to drag it out more in public. One thing I think Prodigy has going against it, and this isn't anything that I have any direct experience with, but I've certainly heard from lots of people. It's public knowledge, and I think most of us have heard it, Prodigy has a history of promising things to their players that they haven't delivered. And so I think that's going to be a problem for them in terms of public opinion. And I think that might be partly why the backlash from this has been so strong against Prodigy. This isn't the first time that we've heard a player complain about Prodigy. So, I think the resolution of this dispute is going to be very interesting to watch it play out. But I'm also really interested to see, what does this mean for Prodigy long term?
Yeah, certainly. So let's just say, for example, that this does go to trial. Let's say that Gannon, his team has an awesome case. They win. They prevail in the case. Could you see in that scenario a countersuit? And is that something that he may have an option to do?
Yeah, so the way that it typically works, usually, the document that starts the lawsuit is called a complaint. So Prodigy has filed their complaint. In most jurisdictions, I assume this is the case in Georgia, but I don't know this for sure, but in most jurisdictions, the defendant has 30 days to file an answer to that complaint. It is very common for defendants to request and receive an extension of time to answer, out to maybe 60 days or even 90 days sometimes before they file their answer. But if an answer is filed, if the case doesn't get settled and there is an answer filed, that would be the time that we will learn whether Gannon has a or believes that he has a counterclaim to file against Prodigy. And I suspect they probably would.
Okay. And is that counterclaim, could that be another means of getting to settlement by just saying, basically, we're going to tie you up in a countersuit as well? Like, this is going to go both ways?
Yeah, I mean, the old saying that you hear so often is really true, which is, when there's a big lawsuit like this, the only winners are the lawyers. If this thing drags out, the legal fees would likely, I mean, it's not going to be $1.5 million in legal fees probably, but the legal fees will be significant and may exceed the award that either side could get. It's another, really big way that pressure is put on the parties to settle. Neither party wants to spend all that money. Another interesting thing to keep in mind, Prodigy is asking Gannon to pay their attorney's fees.
Yes.
And so that has to be a consideration as well. I'm optimistic, and I really think that this will settle quickly, but I think it would be very interesting to see Gannon's answer and any counterclaims that might come back. And if that happens, we may be having another conversation like this going, whoa, look what's in Gannon's court filing. Can you believe this?
Well, I'll tell you, honestly, Chris, if this thing does, not settle and we go on for a few years, I'm going to have you on retainer just as a recurring guest on our show. It's just going to have to be like that. One thing, you mentioned that clause about having to cover the legal fees. So as soon as one of my former roommates is currently doing his law degree at the University of Texas. So he was like my first law resource. And as soon as I messaged him, he kind of dug in for me because he had access to like the law journals and things like that. And one of the first things he noticed was that clause. And also he was researching the attorneys involved. And he noticed that Prodigy, he said, the firm they were using was a pretty big deal firm, he said. So he was guessing that the legal costs could get pretty big, and like maybe that could explain like Prodigy's confidence if they're saying, hey, you're going to cover this fee for us. Is that something you see? Like, do you see that clause more as a vote of confidence in the party, or maybe even more of a scare tactic? Like, when do you see that a lot? Is it common?
Yes. Attorney's fees clauses are common in all forms of commercial contracts. Not always in there, but I would say probably more often than not they are.
Okay.
The interesting thing to understand, though, is judges do have discretion whether to honor those clauses or not. And I think because in the United States, the general rule is each side pays their own attorney's fees. Judges most judges don't like to mess with that too much. And so I think that is there in situations where perhaps if one party really acted egregiously, that would be an appropriate time for a judge to award attorney's fees. I don't see that here. I think in this case, each side has some valid arguments against the other. I think this is a legitimate dispute. I don't think anybody's getting out of line or, trying to, file frivolous claims or anything like that. So whether the judge would actually honor that attorney's fees clause or not remains to be seen.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that came down to the judge. That'll be certainly something to watch. Now, one of the big questions and kind of theories that have been developed is the idea that Gannon could have some kind of minor defense in this case, with the idea that he obviously was a minor when the contract was signed. Now, there was a co-signer being his legal guardian, and there's been some people looking into those laws. Is that something you've looked into at all, or that you believe could be present in this case?
Yeah, that's one thing I went right to. I did research that under Georgia law. I don't think that Gannon could get very far arguing that the contract's not valid because he's a minor. And it's for the exact reason you said. He did have his legal guardian sign for him. Interestingly, if you get into the court documents, there's actually another document. It was, I think, maybe attached to his contract. It's something like a Prodigy code of player conduct or something like that. I believe that Gannon signed only. So there might be some kind of a little crack in the armor there where, if Prodigy's, as part of their lawsuit, is trying to hold him to that code of conduct that he signed but his mom didn't, maybe there's something there. I don't think so, and I think that's why we haven't seen Gannon's lawyers raise that issue at all. I just don't think there's anything there.
Yeah, well, and that kind of takes me to one of our last few questions here, and this is the way that this all unfolded from the start with the announcement from Gannon that he's leaving, making it very public, very quick. And from my perception, and this is speculation, I just saw a sense of confidence that they were going to be able to get out of this. That's all I've seen so far, and I think that a countersuit would maybe point to that even more potentially. But that's kind of the vibe I was getting. Then when I looked at the case filings, I was expecting to see basically the dagger, like, oh, there it is. And then I was kind of like, oh, well, maybe Prodigy, they seem to have a case here pretty legit. They might have it locked up. So do you think that, why do you think they had so much confidence when terminating that contract in the first place? Do you think there is something up their sleeve, or this is just, I don't know, that maybe a misjudgment? What is your perception of that?
Well, I think I may have a little bit different opinion on this than most lawyers would.
Okay.
Because I've heard a lot of people say, oh, Gannon shouldn't have gone on Instagram and done that. He had his attorney send the letter terminating the contract that day, and then he literally went on Instagram and made that video that day. This is how I see it. Gannon's theory of the case is, I had a contract with Prodigy. Prodigy breached it. I took the steps necessary to terminate it, and therefore the contract is terminated, and I'm going to conduct myself accordingly. It's almost as if he had been more cautious and hadn't made that announcement. That's almost sort of like an admission from him that he really isn't sure, is my contract terminated or not? So I actually give him credit for doing that, because what he did was consistent with his theory of what happened. His theory of reality doesn't align with Prodigy's theory, but I don't really fault him for doing that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Having a very consistent take on things. If they believe that what they did was all in line and in order, then it would make sense to proceed as you would. So that does make sense to me. Okay, so final question I had, and this is something I was really curious about, and there was a few people that said it on Twitter too, is What is the closest, a lot of legal cases, it's all about precedent, right? Like, citing laws and cases to bring that in and strengthen your case. I remember an undergrad scrolling through these journals, just trying to find something that related to case studies. Like, that was a big part of it. So what is the closest precedent that you think can be used in this case? Are we going to see like other sports being used, or is it just going to be stuff that's more random? Like, what do you think?
That's a really good question, and I'm probably not going to have a very good answer. It would take some digging for me to really figure out whether there's some type of case out there that's directly on point. I mean, I think you and I both would probably know if there had been a published court case where a sponsor sued a disc golfer. And as you probably remember from the class that you took, most of what we rely on as legal precedent are actually opinions from appeals courts and superior courts, at the state and federal level. So it's not even a situation where necessarily we would need to find a case like a trial that was directly on point. It typically have to be something that was appealed to a higher court. I'm not aware of anything directly on point. I bet there's probably thousands of cases that could be informative, that could perhaps suggest something along these lines. So, if these lawyers end up filing briefs and making arguments, we'll have the answer. We'll know what cases they choose to rely on.
Yeah, I know. It's like I want to see this resolved, but part of me wants to see some of it unfold just to see how they proceed. Like, what's the next play? Like, I'm sure for you, like, as somebody, like I said, there's some excitement to like wonder how they're going to attack this. It's like our worlds colliding, basically. So.
I might have to take off work and just go and sit in the courtroom if this thing ever really does go to trial, because I think it would be fascinating. I think it'd be entertaining. But like I said before, I think the chances of that are extremely small.
Yeah, I already told Hunter, I said, if this thing goes to court, I'm at the courtroom. There's no doubt about it. I don't care if I have to sit outside, if I have to sit in the rain.
I'll see you there.
All right. I would be there for sure. All right. Well, that's all the questions I had. I think you answered a ton for me and hopefully for everybody listening. We will certainly just going to have to see how this proceeds. And I'd be surprised if we don't have you on at least one more time, whether it's for a wrap up or for the next step of things. But thanks so much, Chris, for joining. It was great having your legal expertise here on the show.
I was honored to come on and happy to come back anytime, Trevor. Thank you.
All right. Thanks once again to Chris for joining the show. That was honestly one of my favorite interviews I've had the chance to do. I love the legal world, and I really enjoyed getting to interview an expert in that area and just kind of pick his brain on everything that's going on in this really unprecedented situation right now. So I would expect that there's a good chance Chris could be back on the show sometime in the future, especially as this case continues to proceed, or almost guaranteed whatever happens in this case, we'll have Chris on at least one more time to kind of wrap things up at the very least. But we'll just kind of have to see how things go. But it was great talking to him and learning a bit more about that. Make sure to check out discgolf.law if you're interested about more what Chris is doing. And other than that, we'll see you next week with another great episode.